Beyond absence, love, loss, and the bonds of family. My wife just passed away. My father told me to marry another woman, just like he did. This started a war between us. I am a 26-year-old male who lost my wife, Annie, over a year ago when our two children were only 18 months and 4 years old. She was only 25. Annie and I had two kids who were barely 18 months and 4 years old at the time, almost the exact age I was when I lost my mom. The parallel was chilling, and it forced me to confront the full circle my life had taken. I was only 5 when my mom passed away. It's one of those memories that isn't just a single moment. It's like a shadow that stretched long over my childhood. Growing up, everything seemed a bit grayer, a bit more muted without her. The house was quieter, and Dad was always busy trying to fill the void her absence left in every corner of our life. He did his best, but you could tell he was just as lost in grief as I was, even though he tried to hide it behind long hours at work and forced smiles at dinner. I remember feeling perpetually confused too. Why my mom? Why our family? Friends would talk about their moms, their plans for Mother's Day, and it felt like living in a world where everyone else had something precious that I had lost. Birthdays and holidays were the hardest. Dad tried, he really did, but there's a particular kind of emptiness that comes from missing a person who was supposed to be there for those moments. As I grew older, that confusion turned into a deep-seated fear of loss, clinging too tightly to relationships or shying away from them entirely to avoid the potential heartbreak. It wasn't until much later in my own adult relationships that I began to understand the depth of my fear. Therapy helped. Talking about her, about the memories and the pain made it more bearable. Losing mom so young fundamentally shaped who I am. It made me more empathetic towards others' pain, more aware of the fragility of life. Back then, the world seemed suddenly bigger and more intimidating without my mom. Even though I was too young to comprehend all the ways her passing would impact me, I felt her absence in every part of my daily life. There was an emptiness at home, a silence that wasn't just about the lack of her voice, but about the missing layer of love and security she represented. Annie always had this vivid memory of her dad, how he'd lift her high above his head and make her feel like she could touch the clouds. She was just 6 when he was taken from her, swept away by a sudden illness that none of us were ready to face. That loss carved a deep, aching void in her life, one that shaped her in ways she only sometimes talked about. She grew up determined to be the pillar her dad couldn't be for her, to build a fortress of love for our kids that nothing could penetrate, not even death. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a crisp fall morning, much like any other, except Annie wasn't feeling well. We thought little of it at first, a passing bug, we hoped, but it turned out to be much more serious. Within months, we were grappling with a reality that mirrored her deepest fears. Annie was diagnosed with a terminal illness, the kind that sneaks up silently but quickly overwhelms. In those final months, Annie's resolve to make lasting memories with our kids became everything. Every day, despite her waning strength, she'd spend time with them, reading stories, playing games, or just holding them close, embedding her presence in their lives in ways she hoped would be indelible. She often spoke to me late at night, her voice a mixture of determination and despair, about her need to leave a legacy of love for them, to be there in their hearts and minds even when she could no longer be there in person. She wanted so desperately to break the cycle of loss that had shadowed her childhood, to give our kids the stable, loving foundation she had lost so early on. Her biggest fear was repeating history, leaving our kids with the same hollow memories and unanswerable questions she had struggled with. Watching Annie with our children, I saw the lengths she went to imprint her love on their young lives. She would record videos for them, leave little notes in unexpected places, and create traditions that could carry on in her absence. Her creativity in weaving these threads of connection was both inspiring and heart-wrenching. When she passed, the loss was monumental, echoing the emptiness of her own childhood, but also filled with the richness of the love she had poured into every moment with them. Annie had always had a clear vision of her own funeral, unusual as that might sound. It was something we talked about occasionally, those strange, somber discussions that unexpectedly pop up and linger between a couple. She wanted it to be more a celebration of her life than a mourning of her death. "Don't make it all doom and gloom," she'd say, half joking but serious about the essence of her wishes. "Make it a day where everyone can remember the happy times, with lots of flowers and maybe even some fireworks." When it happened, I was plunged into a deep grief that was hard to navigate, filled with the pain of loss, but also the duty to honor her final wishes. The day of her funeral arrived on a bright and clear morning, which felt almost offensive in the context of our loss, yet fitting for the type of farewell she had envisioned. The service was held at our local church, a place she had chosen not just for its spiritual significance, but also for its beautiful stained glass windows and the way the sunlight danced through them in the mornings. It was here, under the vivid colors cast by the morning light, that friends and family gathered, not in black, but in bright colors as she had requested. Flowers adorned every surface, wildflowers, her favorite, in vibrant hues of blues, yellows, and reds, creating a tapestry of color that transformed the usually somber space into one that was alive with remembrance and love. The air was filled with her favorite music, a mix of classic rock and folk tunes, songs that had soundtracked our life together. Each melody stirred memories, bringing smiles even through the tears. After the service, we moved to a nearby park, another place Annie loved. It was here that the atmosphere lightened as people shared their stories about Annie, her quirks, her laugh, her boundless energy. It felt like she was there with us, in the laughter and the shared memories. As the sun began to set, we prepared for the final act of the day, the fireworks. It was an unconventional choice, but it was exactly what she had wanted. As the first rocket shot into the sky, bursting into a cascade of color, it felt like a release, a letting go of some of the sorrow and a celebration of a spirit too vibrant to ever be really gone. Each explosion of light was a reminder of her vibrant life, a punctuating finale that she would have loved. Now, as I watch our children grow, I see Annie's influence in their resilience, their laughter, and even in their tears. They talk about her often, recalling moments I didn't even realize they remembered. It's clear that while death took Annie away too soon, her efforts to be a present, loving force in their lives didn't go in vain. She lives on through them, through the stories we share and the love we keep alive. As their father, my role has evolved to not just nurturing them, but also preserving the essence of what Annie wanted for them, a sense of security, love, and the knowledge that they were, and always will be cherished, no matter what life throws our way. Now, as I watch my own children, I see that same confusion and loss reflected in their eyes. They look for Annie in simple moments, when they accomplish something small like tying their shoelaces, or when they need comfort after a bad dream. I know those feelings. I live them. It's a reminder of how deeply a child feels the absence of a parent, often in ways they can't fully express. This shared experience has deepened my empathy and understanding of my children's emotions. I often find myself navigating their grief while managing my own, trying to be the rock that they can lean on. It's not just about providing for them materially, but ensuring they feel safe and loved, that they have space to miss their mom without feeling like they need to hide their grief. Their journey through loss has also reshaped my approach to parenting. I'm more patient, more attuned to the unspoken parts of their sadness, and more proactive in addressing our emotional health as a family. We talk about Annie often, keeping her memory alive, not as a shadow that hangs over us, but as a light that continues to guide us. I strive to be present in a way I felt my dad struggled to be after my mom died. Seeing my children cope with their loss, I understand the long road ahead of them. I know the challenges they'll face as they grow up without their mom, but I also see their resilience, and it gives me hope. It reminds me that while the pain of loss never fully disappears, it can be woven into the fabric of our lives, making us stronger and more connected to each other. I've promised myself to be there for them, to help them navigate this journey, and to ensure they never doubt they are loved, both by their mom, whose love continues beyond her absence, and by me, who stands with them every step of the way. After my mom passed away, the house felt suspended in time, with remnants of her life tucked into every corner. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books remained on the shelves, and the air carried the gentle hint of her perfume. This stillness, this preserved world of hers was abruptly disrupted when my dad announced he was remarrying. It was barely a year since we'd lost her, and the news fell on me like a cold wave. Ellen moved in shortly after their wedding. She brought with her boxes filled with new items, new routines, and a new presence that seemed to flood the spaces my mom had once inhabited. Her attempts at reorganizing the house, from rearranging the living room to replacing the curtains my mom had chosen, felt less like mere changes and more like erasures of the life we had lived. Ellen was kind, or at least she tried to be. She would cook meals she thought I would enjoy and make small talk, attempting to bridge the gap between us. However, her efforts felt forced. Each kind gesture, no matter how well intended, felt like an intrusion, as if she was trying to stitch herself into the fabric of a family portrait where she didn't quite belong. I resisted, not out of spite for her as a person, but out of a deep-seated loyalty to my mom's memory and a child's grief that clung stubbornly to the past. The situation at home grew tense. My reactions to Ellen's changes ranged from silent withdrawal to outright defiance. I would put things back where Mom had left them, insist on using the same old dishes instead of the new ones Ellen brought, and avoid spending time in the newly redecorated spaces. I missed the familiarity of my old life, the comfort of knowing every corner held a piece of my mom. My dad, caught between his attempt to move forward and his child's resistance, often became frustrated. Arguments became more frequent. He would accuse me of being unreasonable, of not giving Ellen a fair chance. I saw it differently. I felt he was erasing Mom's legacy, pushing me to forget rather than remember. One particularly heated evening, my dad snapped after finding me rearranging the living room to its original state. "We can't live in a museum," he yelled. "We have to move on. You have to move on." But how could I move on? Mom's shadow was in every laughter that had echoed through these rooms, in every step I took around the furniture she had carefully chosen, in every scent that lingered. The house felt increasingly like a battleground, where every alteration to its old state felt like a loss, a reminder of how swiftly and ruthlessly life could change. Ellen, caught in the middle, gradually stopped trying so hard to win me over, retreating instead into whatever peace she could find with my dad. During those initial months after Ellen moved in, the atmosphere in our home became increasingly strained. I was still grappling with the loss of my mom, often finding solace in old photos and mementos that kept her memory alive. My vulnerability and frequent bouts of tears were a stark reminder of the raw pain that lingered in our home. It was during this time that Dad's demeanor towards me shifted drastically. The few times I showed vulnerability or cried for Mom, he reacted not with comfort, but with frustration. He would yell, telling me to grow up and stop crying. It was clear he was grappling with his own pain, but his approach left me feeling abandoned in my grief. One night, after finding me crying in my room with a picture of Mom, he said, "Enough!" His voice echoed against the walls. "You need to grow up and stop crying all the time. Life has to move on." His words, meant to push me towards resilience, felt more like a dismissal of my grief. I looked up at him, my heart sinking. "I miss her, Dad," I managed to choke out, the words barely a whisper. "Why can't you just let me miss her?" His next words were like a cold slap. "I'm happier now, and you should be too. I love Ellen more than I ever loved your mom," he declared with a harsh certainty that seemed to seal the growing gap between us. The room fell silent, save for the quiet sobs that I couldn't hold back. Those words, harsh and raw, sliced through the fragile thread of understanding that had tethered us. I felt not just the loss of my mom, but also the creeping loss of my dad, who was now a stranger, driven by his own grief and newfound happiness. As the years passed, the emotional distance grew. Dad was increasingly absent, not just physically, but emotionally. My cries for attention, for the affection I missed so desperately, went unanswered. His priorities had shifted, and I felt sidelined, an unwelcome reminder of a past he wanted to forget. Ellen, for all her efforts, could never bridge the gap between Dad and me. It felt like a betrayal, not just of Mom's memory, but of the father-son bond we should have had. Feeling abandoned and misunderstood, I withdrew into myself. The isolation at home led me to seek solace elsewhere, in books, in school activities, anywhere I could find a semblance of the care and attention I lacked at home. But the impact of those formative years lingered. I harbored a deep-seated mistrust for relationships, fearful of being left behind again, of loving someone who might one day decide I wasn't worth sticking around for. As an adult, looking back, I can see that Dad was dealing with his grief in his own flawed way. But the understanding of his pain does little to soothe the resentment and hurt of a child who felt left behind. Now facing my own challenges as a widower, I'm determined to be the father to my children that I needed when I was their age. One who is present, supportive, and unconditionally loving, no matter what life throws our way. But after Annie died, my dad reached out to tell me he hoped I understood him better and cut him some slack for everything. I didn't respond to him at the time because I was in the most immediate sense of grief. Still today, it's still raw, but I'm in therapy to try and find peace in my life. He reached out to me a few more times, and he apologized for his initial message. We met up a few days ago per his request. We met at a quiet cafe, a neutral place that seemed suitable for what was already a tense discussion waiting to unfold. As I sat across from him, still wearing my wedding ring, a stark symbol of my ongoing grief, it didn't take long for the conversation to veer into uncomfortable territory. He noticed the ring almost immediately and took it as a cue to voice his thoughts on moving forward. "You can't keep living in the past," he said. "It's time to think about your future. Maybe start meeting people again." I clenched my jaw, feeling the old frustration simmer. I asked him to drop the subject, but he pressed on, perhaps thinking that pushing me was for my own good. That's when he brought up his own past, his quick remarriage after my mom's death. He explained, not for the first time, but certainly in the most explicit way, how his new wife had brought him happiness, something he thought was impossible after Mom. "I needed that, and I think you do too," he said earnestly. "I thought you'd understand by now, especially with the kids needing a mother figure." His words stung sharply. It wasn't just the suggestion that I replace Annie, but the implication that my grief was somehow a selfish indulgence, that I should move past for the sake of the kids. He went further, saying that he hoped I would eventually see the benefit of his choices, that I would stop holding on to my resentment and realize that embracing someone new wasn't a betrayal of my late wife. I told him firmly, "It doesn't work that way. Grieving isn't just something you turn off to make room for someone else, and it certainly doesn't work on a convenient timeline." I could see the frustration in his face, mirroring the anger in mine. "You think I hate you for being happy with her, but it's not about that. It's about how you handled everything when Mom died, how you pushed her memory out as if it was the only way to be happy again." He was taken aback by my bluntness. Perhaps he hadn't realized how deeply his actions had hurt me, or maybe he had never considered that his path to happiness had left a trail of pain in its wake. Our conversation grew heated, voices raised enough that other patrons shot us wary glances. The air was tense as my father and I reached a fragile point in our conversation. His earlier remarks about moving on and finding new love had pushed me to a breaking point. Seeing the shock on his face when I challenged his views on grief and moving forward, he paused, looking genuinely bewildered. "How do you expect to find someone else to love you and the kids if you're still hung up on Annie?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern, but also a hint of frustration. It was a question that might have been genuine in his mind, but felt like an accusation to me. "Annie was the love of my life," I replied, my voice firm, each word laden with unyielding truth. "And yes, I'm still hung up on her because love doesn't just end when someone dies. You don't just replace someone like that." I could see him trying to process my words, his eyes searching mine for something, perhaps a sign of the son he once knew, who hadn't been shattered by loss. I continued, "My children, they are my heart, Dad. They're the other loves of my life. But it's different. They depend on me not just to love them, but to provide safety, security, and a sense of normalcy in a world that was turned upside down." The cafe noises faded into the background as I leaned in slightly, needing him to really hear me. "It's my job, my duty to give them the best life I can. That doesn't mean rushing to fill a void with a new person. It means being there for them fully, without distractions or replacements for their mom. He was stunned, perhaps by the intensity of my conviction, or maybe by the realization that our views on handling grief and love were worlds apart. "But you need someone too," he finally muttered, almost to himself, a note of sadness creeping into his voice. "I needed my dad when I lost my mom," I shot back, the words spilling out with a mix of pain and defiance. "But instead, I got a man who was too quick to move on, too quick to replace her. I won't do that to my kids. I won't let them feel as I did, secondary to someone else's happiness." We were at the end of our coffees, the dregs cold and bitter, much like the mood that had settled over our table. As my father eyed me, ready to offer another piece of his mind on how I should live my life, I cut him off. The frustration and hurt from years of bottled-up feelings were brimming over. "I need to make this clear," I began, my voice steady but filled with resolve. "I will never, ever tell my children to just get over their mom's death. I'm not going to sit them down and tell them their mom is dead and that they need to accept a new mother." The cafe, usually a backdrop of clinking cups and indistinct chatter, seemed to quieten around us. My dad watched me, his expression hardening as he prepared to defend his own actions again. But I wasn't finished. "And another thing," I continued, "I'm not going to scold them for missing her, for crying out for her at night. It's normal. They're kids and they lost their mother. How could I possibly take that grief and make it about someone else's discomfort? That's not what they need. They need a dad who understands their pain, not one who silences it." My dad shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly dropping to the table before meeting mine again. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered, his voice a mix of defensiveness and weariness. "I think you forgot it when it mattered," I shot back, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You remarried so quickly, and it felt like you were trying to erase Mom from our lives. You expected me to just accept it, to be okay with all the changes, because you were." I leaned forward, making sure my point was clear. "I am not looking to find them a new mother. What I am striving to do is to be the best dad I can be, given the lousy hand we've been dealt. I want to give them stability, love, and understanding, not rush to fill a perceived gap with the first person who comes along." I paused, my heart pounding with the intensity of the confession. "And I will never, ever make them feel like they are second to anyone else in my life the way you did with me. You made it clear you loved your new wife more, and I felt like I had lost you too, not just Mom." He finally said something about regret, how he regretted that I couldn't see his perspective, that maybe one day I'd understand. But as I walked away from that cafe, I knew that understanding wasn't just about seeing his point of view. It was about recognizing the deep divides in how we process loss. I wasn't ready to forgive his past actions just because he had found happiness. My path was different, and I needed him to respect that without judgment or pressure. As I drove home, the weight of our fractured relationship heavier than ever, I realized that some gaps might be too wide to bridge, at least for now. The last time I saw my dad at that cafe, it felt like a definitive line had been drawn. In the weeks that followed, he tried to reach out a few times. Texts, a couple of voicemails, his voice always holding that familiar mix of concern and awkwardness, as if he wasn't quite sure what to say or how to say it without reigniting the flames of our last argument. Each attempt at bridging the gap seemed to remind me of the wide chasm that had formed between us over the years. I wasn't ready to cross it yet, so I responded sparingly, my replies brief and non-committal, until eventually I stopped responding altogether. The silence that settled wasn't peaceful, but it was necessary. Life went on, as it does, filled with the daily routines and small crises of raising two kids alone. I threw myself into being a dad. The soccer games, school projects, bedtime stories. Every smile and tear from my kids reminded me of my promise to be the steady presence they needed. I often thought about that conversation with my dad, turning over his words in my mind, questioning the harshness of my responses and the rigidity of my stance. Yet every time I considered reaching out, I remembered the feeling of being a kid who felt second best, and I'd retreat, convinced I needed more time. Months turned into a year. The seasons changed, and so did the kids. They grew taller, their faces losing the last traces of toddlerhood. My dad's attempts to connect became a memory, almost as distant as the happier times before Mom's death. In the quiet moments late at night, when the house was still and my mind refused to rest, I pondered the cost of my steadfastness. Was holding on to my hurt worth the growing silence between us? The thought unsettled me enough to consider that perhaps it was time to try a different approach. Not for my sake, but for the kids, who deserve to know all facets of their family, even the complicated ones. The next morning, I drafted a message to my dad. Simple, yet more open than anything I'd sent in a long time. "Let's talk," it read. "When you're ready." I wasn't sure where a conversation might lead us, or whether it would heal any old hurts, but I knew it was a start, a small step toward understanding, or at least coexistence in this new chapter of our lives. As I hit send, the silence I had grown accustomed to seemed a little less daunting, tinted with the possibility of something new.